April 1884. The westbound train out of Omaha was 4 hours late into Dry Fork, Nebraska territory, and Eliza Calder spent every one of those hours deciding how she would tell the man on the platform that she had changed her mind. She was 25 years old, the unmarried daughter of a Boston bookbinder who had died owing more than he had ever earned, and she had answered a stranger's advertisement for a wife the way a person steps off a ledge. Not because she wanted to fall, but because the ground she was standing on had already given way. The advertisement had been honest, which she had mistaken for kindness. Wanted: a wife of sound character and steady temper, willing to work, no illusions about comfort. Offered: a half section of grass, a sound house, an honest name. She had read it 40 times. She had read everything else too. Every letter he sent, 11 of them across the winter, in a cramped, careful hand that spelled poorly and apologized for it. And somewhere over the long flat miles of that April morning, watching the last green of the east thin out into a brown nothing that went on past where her eyes could hold it, she had understood the size of the mistake she was making, and she had decided to unmake it. She would tell him. She would take the next train back to a city that did not want her either, and at least there the loneliness would be a familiar one. That was the plan she carried down the iron steps of the rail car at Dry Fork, her valise in one hand and a worn, brown leather-bound book pressed to her chest with the other, the way she had carried books her whole life, as a kind of shield. She had rehearsed the words until they were smooth. "I am grateful for your letters, sir, but I cannot in honesty become your wife." She had it ready, and then she saw him, and the words went out of her like air from a struck lung. He was not what the advertisement had let her imagine. She had built, across the winter, a hard man, a man who wanted a wife the way he might want a mule, for the work that was in her. The man on the platform was nothing of the kind. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, early 30s, with tousled dark brown hair and a short dark beard and a sun-lined face that had clearly practiced this morning at being calm and was failing. He held his tan, wide-brim hat in both hands against his chest, turning the brim around and around. And when he saw her step down, he went very still, the way a man goes still when something he has only let himself want in secret turns out to be real. His gray-blue eyes found her face and stayed there. He did not look at her figure or her dress or the dust on her hem. He looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been too proud to ask out loud. "Miss Calder," he said. His voice came out rough and he cleared it. "Wade Harlan. Your letters didn't do you justice, ma'am, and I mean that as a kindness, not an impertinence." He stopped, reddening above the beard. "I had a whole thing I was going to say. I wrote it down. I left it in the wagon." And there, on a windy platform in a town that was 4 buildings and a water tank, Eliza Calder opened her mouth to deliver her smooth refusal and discovered she could not do it. Not because she had changed her mind. She had not yet, but because the man in front of her had ridden in his good coat to meet a stranger off a train, had written out words and lost his nerve about them and was standing there braced for her to be disappointed in him. To refuse him in that first minute would have been a cruelty she had not budgeted for. So she said instead, the truest small thing she had, "It is very flat here." And Wade Harlan laughed, a startled, honest laugh, and said, "Yes, ma'am, it surely is. Gets in your blood, though, the flat. You can see your trouble coming 3 days off." And he reached, carefully, for her valise, and she let him take it, and the plan to leave folded itself up quietly inside her and waited. This, then, was the irony she would only see the shape of much later. She had crossed half a continent to say no to a man, and the saying of it had been the one thing the journey did not prepare her for. She had armored herself against cruelty, against greed, against a husband who would treat her like livestock, and she had no armor at all against a shy man turning his hat in his hands. She told herself it was only that she was tired, that she would deliver the refusal at the house, where there was no audience, no station agent pretending not to listen. The wagon ride out was an hour over a track that was less a road than a suggestion, and Wade talked the whole way in the manner of a shy man who has decided that silence would be worse. About the grass, which was better than it looked, about the well, which was good and deep, about the winter just past, which had killed 2 of his neighbor's cattle and none of his, because he had cut and stacked more hay than any sensible man would, and been laughed at for it all autumn. "They call me careful like it's an insult," he said. "I'd rather be laughed at in October than frozen in February." Eliza, watching the enormous country roll by, found that she agreed with him, and was annoyed at how much. The house was not what she had feared either. It was small, but it was sound. 2 real rooms and a loft, the boards tight, a stove that drew well. He had whitewashed the inside. There was a shelf he had built, she saw, that held no books at all, 3 empty feet of pine waiting, and she understood without being told that he had built it for her, on the strength of 11 letters in which she had written too much about the only thing she owned that he could not provide. She stood looking at that empty shelf with her brown book still pressed to her chest, and the refusal she had carried 1,500 miles died in her throat for good. She did not tell him she had meant to leave. She told him, instead, that she would stay the summer, and they would see. That she would not be married until she was sure, and that she would earn her keep in the meantime and sleep in the loft. She braced for him to argue, or to sulk, or to remind her that he had paid her passage and was owed. He did none of it. He took his hat off again, which she came to learn was the thing he did when he meant something all the way down, and he said, "That's fair, Miss Calder. That's more than fair. A person ought to be sure." And he carried her valise up the loft ladder, and that was the bargain. That first night she lay awake in the loft listening to the strangeness of it. No church bells, no rattle of a city street, no neighbors through a shared wall, only the wind moving over a country so large it seemed to have a sound of its own, low and continuous like the breathing of something asleep. She heard him below her, banking the stove, and then the creak of the rope bed as he lay down, and then a long stillness in which she knew. The way you know such things in the dark, that he was lying awake too, careful not to make a sound that might trouble her. A lesser man would have used the marriage that wasn't yet a marriage as a lever. This one lay still under his own roof, so a frightened stranger overhead could sleep. She had not known, until that night, that a person could feel safe and unmarried at the same time. It was a new arithmetic, and she turned it over until the wind put her under. The summer taught her she had been wrong about almost everything. She had thought herself useless on a farm, a city woman good for nothing but mending and reading, and she discovered she was good at a great many things once a person stopped telling her she could not do them. She learned to set bread, and to doctor a sick calf, and to read the sky. Wade taught her without ever once making the teaching feel like charity. He simply did the work beside her and let her watch, and when she got it wrong, he said, "Near enough," and showed her again, and when she got it right, he did not make a fuss, which she came to understand was its own kind of respect. He was, she found, the most patient man she had ever met, and the loneliest, and the two things were connected. He had been alone on that grass for 6 years, talking mostly to horses, and he had learned to want very little out loud so that the wanton would not crush him. She learned the country in pieces that summer, and each piece corrected something she had believed in Boston. She had thought the prairie empty. It was not empty, it was only quiet. And once she learned to look, she found it crowded. Meadowlarks and prairie chickens, the burrow towns of the little owls, antelope standing at the edge of seeing, a sky that staged a different enormous drama every evening for no audience but the two of them. She had thought herself fragile. She sunburned and blistered, and her soft hands cracked and then hardened, and she did not break. She had thought that a marriage of advertisement and circumstance must be a cold thing, a contract between strangers, and she discovered that the opposite was nearer the truth, that there is a particular tenderness in two people who owe each other nothing and choose, each ordinary day, to be kind anyway. By midsummer, she could not remember clearly the version of Wade Harlan she had built across the winter, the hard man wanting a mule. She tried, sometimes, to summon him, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts, and she could not. The real one had written over him entirely. The town did not approve of her. Dry Fork was small, and what there was of it had opinions, and the chief of them belonged to a man named Royden Carthers, who owned the store and the only money lending in 40 miles, and a great deal of the grass that Wade's half-section poked into like a thorn. Carthers was silver-haired and soft-handed and smiled while he said hard things. He had wanted Wade's land for years. It sat across the only reliable water for a long way, and he had been waiting, the way patient, cruel men wait, for a bad season to fold the stubborn young homesteader into debt. A wife complicated that. A wife meant Wade might dig in and stay. So Carthers made it his small daily business, across that summer, to remind the town that the Eastern woman would not last the winter, that she would run home to her books at the first hard frost, that Harlan had spent good money fetching out a bride who would leave him poorer than she found him. He said it in the store and at the church door and anywhere Eliza could hear it, and he said it gently, smiling, which was the worst way. She might have proven him right. There was a week in late August when the loneliness of the place pressed on her so hard she nearly packed the valise, when the wind never stopped and the nearest woman was 9 miles off, and she would have given a year of her life for a street with people in it. Wade saw it on her. He did not beg her to stay. He did a stranger and a finer thing. He hitched the wagon on a Sunday and drove her the 9 miles to the next homestead, to a young wife named Ada Boone, who had 3 children and a starved hunger for the company of another woman. And he left the two of them alone all afternoon and came back at dusk to fetch her. And on the ride home he said only, "Folks need folks. I forget it, living the way I do. You shouldn't have to." And Eliza, who had spent her whole life being told that her needs were an inconvenience, sat beside that quiet man under a sky gone purple and orange to the edges of the world, and understood that she was not going anywhere. Not because she could not leave, because she no longer wanted to. She told him so in September, on the porch, in the plain way the country had taught her. She said she had come west meaning to refuse him on the platform, and had carried the refusal in her mouth the whole first day, and was telling him now only because she would not build a marriage on a thing left unsaid. She watched him take it. She thought it might wound him. Instead, Wade Harlan was quiet a long moment, looking out at the grass going gold, and then he said, "I figured. You had the look of a person fixin' to be polite about something." And he smiled, tired and kind. I'm glad you stayed long enough to find out you didn't have to be." They were married 3 weeks later by a circuit preacher in the front room, with Ada Boone and her husband for witnesses, and Eliza wore her navy blue dress and put her 11 letters in her one brown book on the pine shelf he had built, and for the first time the shelf was not empty, and neither was she. Then the winter came, and it came the way Carthers had promised it would. Only it did not break the woman. It broke the men who had bet against her. The first blizzard hit in the second week of November, 3 days early and twice as hard as the almanac swore, and it did not stop being winter again until April. The snow came down off the high plains in walls. Cattle that had been left on open grass walked into drifts and did not walk out. The cold got into the seams of poorly built houses and killed an old man 12 miles south in his own bed. And all across that country, the careful work Wade Harlan had been laughed at for. The hay stacked too high, the windbreak he had planted that everyone said was a waste of a young tree, the second stove he had hauled out, and that Carthers had called the folly of a man with more dollars than sense. All of it turned out to be the difference between living and not. But it was Eliza, that winter, who turned out to be the thing Wade himself had not known to plan for. Because in January, the fever came through the scattered homesteads, the lung fever that traveled the cold like it was a road, and it took Wade down hard. A man who had not been sick in 6 years, flat on his back and burning, useless, frightened in the way strong men are frightened when their strength goes. And the Eastern bride who could not last the winter put on his coat and his gloves and went out into the storms to do the work of 2. She broke ice on the water twice a day so the stock would not die of thirst in a world made of water. She forked down the hay he had stacked too high and blessed every laughed-at foot of it. She kept 2 stoves going and a man alive, sponging the fever down through nights so cold the cloth froze stiff between the basin and the bed. When their nearest neighbor's roof gave under the snow load, it was Eliza who took the wagon out in a break between storms and brought Ada Boone and her 3 children back to shelter in the loft. 8 people now in 2 rooms and a fire that did not go out. She did the sums on the flour and made it stretch. She did the sums on the firewood and made it stretch. She had been told her whole life she was good for nothing but books, and it turned out that a woman who can do sums and keep her head does not stop being useful just because the temperature drops below what a city can imagine. There was one night that February she never told the whole of, even years later. The worst of the storms had come down in the dark, the kind of cold that is not weather but a presence, and the dog had begun to whine at the door, and she'd understood that one of the horses had broken out of the lean-to and would be dead by morning if she left it. She could not see the barn from the house. She tied a length of clothesline to the door latch and let it out behind her as she went, hand over hand into a white nothing that took the lantern light and gave back none of it, and she found the animal by sound and got a rope on it and got it in, and then she followed the line back, frozen to the bone, and let herself into a warm room where a sick man slept and 3 borrowed children breathed soft in the loft. And she stood with her back against the door and shook and did not cry, because there was no one to spare for it, and there was bread to set for the morning. She had answered an advertisement for a wife of sound character and steady temper. She had become something the advertisement had not thought to ask for and could not have afforded if it had. Royden Carthers, meanwhile, learned the price of betting against the wrong people. He had extended easy credit all autumn to the men he expected the winter to ruin, planning to collect their land in the spring thaw and the winter ruin them past collecting. They did not lose their farms to him so much as walk off them, broke and beaten, leaving him holding paper on land nobody could work and nobody would buy. The grass he had coveted across Wade's water was no use to a man with no neighbors left to work it. He had built his small empire on the certainty that the careful homesteader and his bookish wife would fold, and instead they were the only place for 9 miles with a lit window and a full woodpile and bread to share, and by March the whole thinned-out country knew it. When the thaw finally came and Wade walked out onto his own porch on shaking legs to look at a farm that had come through whole, the first wagon up the lane was not Carther's come to gloat. It was 3 neighbors come to ask, hats in their hands, whether Harlan and his wife might be willing to tell them how it had been done. How the hay, how the stoves, how the windbreak, how a man and a woman the town had written off had kept 8 souls and a herd alive through the worst winter anyone living could remember. They told them. That was the thing about Wade and Eliza Calder Harlan, the thing the country slowly came to understand across the years that followed. They did not hoard what they had learned. The next autumn there was more hay stacked too high on a dozen farms, and more windbreaks planted, and Eliza taught 3 of the homestead wives their letters and their sums in the long evenings, and the shelf in the small sound house filled with more books, lent and returned and lent again, until it was the nearest thing that part of the territory had to a library. The half-section grew. The 2 rooms became 4, and then a real second floor, and the porch, where she had told him the truth, got a swing on it eventually. Dusty blue, where in the evenings of her old age Eliza would sit and watch a country she had once meant to flee, turn gold at the edges, and tell the grandchildren, when they asked how she and their grandfather met, that she had come west to refuse him, and had spent a whole train ride planning her escape, and had stayed instead for 50 years. She would tell it with a particular smile. The people who knew her said, not the smile of a woman who had settled, but of one who had chosen again and again, and been right every time. She had been the joke of Dry Fork once, the Eastern bride who would not last, and she had outlasted the man who started the joke, outlasted the winter that was supposed to prove him right, outlasted nearly everyone who had been so sure they knew what a woman with soft hands and a book to her chest was worth. The textbooks do not have her name. The histories of that country, when they bother with it at all, talk about the railroads and the cattle barons and the men who put up the towns, and they are silent about the woman who broke ice in the dark so a sick man and a borrowed family would see the spring. But the swing is still there, on a porch in Nebraska, and the great-grandchildren keep it painted dusty blue on purpose, because somebody told them once that it mattered, and they were right. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that long first day on the platform the refusal she carried and could not say, then sit with this before you go. How many people in your own life turned out to be nothing like the version you had built of them in your head before you ever met? Tell me in the comments about the one you were most wrong about, the first-minute judgment you had to take all the way back. I read every one of them, and they are the reason this channel exists. And if you want another story about a person the world was certain it had measured, a woman, a winter, a worth nobody saw coming, the next one is waiting for you right here, and I think you'll want to know how it ends.